I wanted to introduce a new text with significant cultural implications, but I thought I would first try to tie things up a bit. While I have been taking a significant amount of time looking at self-help books as of late, my principal goal has been to evaluate how our values have supposedly changed over time, especially since the turn of the 19th to 20th century. In her book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, Susan Cain focuses on how introversion, and even intellectual and creative pursuits, or engaging in quiet and contemplative activities, has been demonized in favor of extroversion. But as Cain also outlines, this is just one small development that has resulted from a combination of factors: the increase in urbanization, the transition from a culture of character to a culture of personality, and the growth of large corporations and the bureaucratic state. I also covered Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People at length, possibly the most popular self-help book of all time. This manual focuses on how its reader, primarily salesmen, can manipulate others to get what they want, namely the potential customer's money. Tracing back the history of the extrovert ideal, that same demonization of introversion, Cain's starting point for her own cultural analysis and history is this same Dale Carnegie and the ideas he presented in How to Win Friends and Influence People and elsewhere. I also expanded beyond Cain and this introversion versus extroversion dichotomy, turning to Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic's Confidence, How Much You Really Need and How to Get It, and how, just as American culture pushes the individual to be extroverted, it also pushes him or her to be confident. Tomas makes a relatively strong case that this obsession with confidence or feeling able is yet another misplaced value, as it usually does not correlate with competence or being able. Indeed, as he argues, low confidence may hold the key to competence and future success. This is at least the logic he follows, before simply advocating that his reader fall in line with the now corporate stylized advice of Dale Carnegie. In conformist fashion, you should be positive, smile, and pretend to be someone you are not, actively manipulating others in order to create a likable personality. Loosely tied together, in short, we can see the themes of conformity and manipulation, and how, on a cultural level, these can be paired with the increasing growth of both the bureaucratic state and the corporation, and, by implication if you will, their growing partnership with one another. Moving on, however, this is where I wanted to bring in William Whyte's The Organization Man, which I already examined in brief in relation to Cain's Quiet. Through Whyte, we can move away from Carnegie's Depression-era salesman directly to the post-World War II middle manager, or junior executive as Whyte names him, and his moral values. It is here, with this specific 1950s figure, where Whyte uncovers an important transition, a major shift in American ideology. As the organization continued to grow, and by the organization, Whyte refers to both bureaucratic bodies and large corporations, so did its demands for loyalty from the individual within its employment. Importantly, while Whyte primarily addresses the middle manager in this scenario, the middle class itself was greatly expanding in the 1950s due to the increase in employment opportunities within these same bureaucratic bodies and large corporations, and, as such, it would certainly seem as if a significant portion of Whyte's commentary might also apply to this larger class as well. But with the new demands for loyalty, large institutions openly attack the supposed American values of old. These are what Whyte sums up as the Protestant ethic. Detaching it from its denominational connotation, he defines this as the pursuit of individual salvation through hard work and competitive struggle. In conjunction, the corporate employee, especially the bureaucratic middle manager, had already been in the process of developing his own new faith, the social ethic. As Whyte writes, its major propositions are three: a belief in the group as the source of creativity, a belief in belongingness as the ultimate need of the individual, and a belief in the application of science to achieve the belongingness. As Whyte expounds, this ethic can be summed up further along the following lines. Man exists as a unit of society. Of himself, he is isolated, meaningless. Only as he collaborates with others does he become worthwhile. For by sublimating himself in the group, he helps produce a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. There should be, then, no conflict between man and society. What we think are conflicts are misunderstandings, breakdowns in communication. By applying the methods of science to human relations, we can eliminate these obstacles to consensus and create an equilibrium in which society's needs and the needs of the individual are one and the same. Essentially, Whyte adds, it is a utopian faith. Here at the outset, however, Whyte qualifies, pointing out the reality of American ideals, citing both the social ethic and the Protestant ethic as mythologies, and individualism as stringent, as selfish as that often preached in the name of the Protestant ethic would never have been tolerated. And in reality, our predecessors cooperated with one another far more skillfully than 19th century oratory would suggest. As he adds elsewhere, an ideal of individualism, which denies the obligations of man to others, is manifestly impossible in a society such as ours. And it is a credit to our wisdom that while we preached it, we never fully practiced it. This is an incredibly important point, given the false association that is consistently pushed between the concept of individualism and the individual being separated off from society, having no real connection and no real roots. These themes are also reflected in Whyte's work, and I will address them at a later point. But as Whyte continues, something of the obverse is true of the social ethic. So complete a denial of the individual won't work either, and even the most willing believers in the group harbor some secret misgivings, some latent antagonisms toward the pressures they seek to deify. Nevertheless, as Whyte outlines, whatever secret misgivings there might be, this latter ethic is still, nonetheless, worrisome. However much of a mythology, it is still a dominant force, just as the Protestant ethic also was in previous decades. And those who most eagerly subscribe to it, he writes, worry very little over the long-range problems of society. It is not that they don't care, but rather that they tend to assume that the ends of organization and morality coincide. And on such matters as social welfare, they give their proxy to the organization. In short, the middle-class American, or at least a fair portion of the middle class, clearly bought into the idea that the bureaucratization and corporatization of the country would ultimately lead to a morally good end for all. They bought into this idea so deeply that they felt it appropriate to leave the entirety of our social welfare up to the supposed beneficence of our ever-expanding bureaucratic bodies and our burgeoning corporations. In sum, they submitted to the organization. They conformed to it, and in an almost total sense, as we shall see. Indeed, it is the conformist nature of this middle manager of the 1950s that is on most prominent display in Whyte's work, even though he himself tries to fight back against that same terminology. As he writes, I do not equate the social ethic with conformity. As he adds elsewhere, this book is not a plea for nonconformity. Such pleas have an occasional therapeutic value, but as an abstraction, nonconformity is an empty goal. And rebellion against a prevailing opinion merely because it is prevailing should no more be praised than acquiescence to it. And here I cannot help but tie in another work I have covered at length, Joost Meerloo's The Rape of the Mind, The Psychology of Thought Control, and Menticide, published in 1956, the very year The Organization Man was also published. An obvious contemporary to Whyte, Meerloo was of the mind of directly instilling in children at least an initial sense of nonconformity, under the very guidance of parents and educators, because of his view that conformity, especially conformity for conformity's sake, left the masses susceptible to brainwashing and totalitarian control. In retrospect, it seems as if we would have benefited from this latter line of thinking, but Whyte was searching for a happy medium with his book, something in between the mythologized individualism of old and the group thinking that was then so characteristic of the organization man. As such, he takes on an almost neutral approach, even shunning any direct criticism of the organization man himself. Intellectual scoldings based on an impossibly lofty ideal may be of some service in upbraiding organization man with his failures, but they can give him no guidance. Such an approach certainly adds to the quality of his writings and indicates a certain trustworthiness. However, although he most certainly could not see what the future would hold, the way he pushes back against the fact that what he is describing is, first and foremost, blind conformity is a mistake, and I am certainly not the only reader who takes this principal theme away from his book. Now, I would not normally reference such front matter, written decades after the original publication of a book, but the 2002 foreword by Joseph Nocera, added to later reprints, is important on at least two accounts. First, Nocera comes to the same conclusion, that the central point the work uncovers is how the corporate and bureaucratic world of the 1950s attacked individualism in favor of conformity, and that the organization man capitulated. Second, and perhaps more importantly, Nocera also cites the idea that the organization no longer operates in this fashion. No corporation would argue that conformity is better than individuality. No corporation believes it anymore. Whyte turned out to be right about so very, very much, but apparently, according to Nocera, his worry about corporate and bureaucratic attacks on individualism were rather overstated, and the pendulum did indeed swing back to the point where individuality and original thought are once again now considered virtues. Amongst the reasons for this swing, Nocera cites the baby boomers and how they entered the workplace with a built-in skepticism toward large corporations and a powerful need to do their own thing. He also points to how larger corporations like General Motors or IBM lost their market share to smaller, nimbler, less bureaucratic companies, coming under attack in the 1980s as world competition heated up. The problem is that, however much built-in skepticism the baby boomers might have had at one time, it seems rather apparent that the majority of them care just as little today about our future as their own parents did in the 1950s, and have turned over concerns about our social welfare to the corporate and bureaucratic system. Although we might have had greater competition in the 1980s, or even in the 1990s with the growth of the internet, large corporations and the bureaucratic state have been growing ever larger and now wield even more power over the individual and his or her choices. And even though it may seem as if you have an abundance of choice, in actuality, you have very little. The corporation may not openly attack individualism like they did during Whyte's time, but individualism has also been reduced in the mainstream to something entirely consumeristic and corporatized. Simultaneously, this same concept of individualism can often enough still be found under attack, used as a scapegoat for our social problems. Even today, it is still all about conformity. We are not dealing with an impossibly lofty ideal, but rather a dangerous precipice, and I believe Whyte's book provides important insight into how we got here. And that is where I will continue next time. I hope to see you there.